we don't often think about rewriting as being a part of the process we should look forward to, but I actually think it's the most essential skill, or one of the most essential skills we can learn as writers. I want to help you to approach rewriting with a better frame of mind and with a really empowered frame of mind so that you can turn your story into the best version and the one that you want to share with the world. If this is your first time here at this channel, my name is Shannon Valenzuela. I am a screenwriter. I am a novelist. I'm a short story writer. I'm also a teacher. And a writing coach. And I'm so excited to be here today with you. Obviously, in an ideal, perfect world, we would all churn out a first draft that doesn't have to be rewritten, but that just doesn't happen, right? Because there's someone on the other end of that story. There's someone receiving that story. We want to make sure that what we think is going on in the story actually lands for the person that we've designed the story for. And sometimes when we get feedback from that person that's on the other end of that story, we find out that there are things in our story that didn't land the way that we want them to. Things that aren't clear, details that got confused, characters that weren't developed fully, holes in the plot that need to get filled in or need to get adjusted, things that need to get taken out that don't feel like they belong, things that need to get added in that feel like they were missing. All of these are aspects of a story that can be fixed in a rewrite. I always say anything and everything can be fixed in a rewrite. That's why I'm such a big believer in the process. So one of the things that can happen when we approach a feedback session is that we get really nervous about it. We get really intimidated by this process. We might not even want to send our story for feedback because we're afraid of what somebody might say. We want to protect the thing that we've just spent so much time creating. And that is a perfectly natural response. It's a perfectly understandable response. We put a lot of ourselves as writers, we put a lot of ourselves into our stories. It's a very vulnerable process to share that imaginative vision with another human being. But here's the thing, right? Ultimately, this thing, we want it to live out in the world. We want it to be seen. We want it to be read or heard, depending on what the medium is that we're creating in. We want our story to live out there in the world. We want it to be seen by people. And so what better way, in a sense, to ensure that the version of it that goes out into the world is the very best that it can be than to go to someone who's trusted and can give you really good, strong advice on how to make that story the best that it could possibly be. So with that in mind, we can approach our feedback sessions, I think, with a little bit better mindset, with the understanding that everyone in that conversation is there for one reason and one reason only, which is to make that story not just good, but great, right? To make that story great so that it touches the hearts and minds of the people that you want to share it with ultimately. When you go into a feedback session, know that the person who's giving you the feedback has the best interest of you and your story in mind. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking their time to sit with you for 30 minutes or an hour, depending on how long you have with this person, to actually walk through their feedback. They care about you getting the best version of your story out into the world. Like I said, they wouldn't be there if they didn't. So know that you have a friendly audience. There's someone who is willing to work with you to help you. Okay, so we can go to them and we can ask questions. We can feel like this is a conversation, not just a barrage of criticism. That's not what it's supposed to be, right? It is a conversation. And I always say, approach those feedback sessions with a professional attitude. You want to be a professional writer. You want to put your stories out in the world. You want to have people read them, love them, right? Share them with people. You are a professional writer. You are a professional writer. That was some of the most transformative words that ever were spoken to me in my entire life. A mentor that I sadly only got to know for a very, very short time, David Farland, some of you may know, was a giant in the fantasy sci-fi world. And I went to one of his writing workshops a number of years ago. And I had the opportunity to sit down with him for a coffee on a one-on-one session at this workshop that he was running. And I kind of told him a bit about my background. I told him what I wanted to do. And he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "You are a professional writer." And for so many years, I wrote that on a card and I tacked it up on my wall. And the reason why is because it reminds me every time I approach a conversation, every time I sit down to do the work, that I am a professional, and that means certain things, right? It means that I have a certain attitude towards my work where I want it to be the best, and I am willing to step back from it and detach from it emotionally so that I can see it clearly and be able to accept feedback on it without getting devastated personally and emotionally. That doesn't mean feedback's not hard to hear sometimes. Of course it is. It's hard for everybody to hear. But if you can approach it with a certain level of professionalism, you know it's not about you, it's about the work. And if it's about the work, you want the best for the work, and so does the person giving you feedback, so you can meet in a common sort of from that common perspective. If you are open and eager to hear what the reader has to say about the work without being defensive about it, that's huge. So that is perhaps my first and most important tip for approaching feedback and approaching a rewrite, is truly to detach emotionally and personally from the work and be open to hearing feedback on it, right? It can be, we can be in a situation where we've decided we're going to send our work out for feedback. But if we have in our mind that we've done everything right, and all we really want to hear from this person is an affirmation or a validation of the fact that we think we've done everything exactly right and the thing is perfect and needs no changes and needs nothing done to it, that feedback session is going to be a waste of everybody's time. That's the hot take, right? It is a waste of your time. It's a waste of the person's time that you had read the thing for you to give you feedback on it. If you are not willing to hear that you made a mistake or could do something better, it's a waste of everyone's time. So approach the conversation with openness. Approach it with this sort of idea that you are willing to hear what someone else has to say. Have a collaborative mindset, have a collaborative spirit. Know that this is something that is going to help you in the long run. And it will help you not just for this particular project, but also for everything that you write in the future. So if you're really invested in this process and you are really dedicated to learning your craft and honing your craft, every feedback session you get, every feedback session is information that you can take into your next project and hopefully avoid making the same mistakes. You'll make different mistakes, and that's totally fine. And you might still make the same mistakes, but maybe they're not as bad as what you used to do. That's how we learn, right? That's how we grow as artists and as writers. You have to almost approach this with the mindset of you are eager to hear and to take in what other people say, but you also are empowered enough to know that you as the writer know your story best, and you as the writer know the vision that you're trying to communicate, and that you are able to make judgments about what comments people give you on the work to decide, is this in the best interest of the vision that I had, or do they actually have a different idea for this story? And if I follow these notes, it's going to take me down a different path. Okay, so you have to, in a sense, know the difference between comments and feedback that is helping you refine a vision, and feedback and comments that are trying to get you to change your vision. And sometimes the vision needs to change. Sometimes the story just doesn't work in the way that it's been conceived. And we do have to make changes to it. But the point that I guess I'm trying to drive at here is that you, as the writer, need to make sure that you feel empowered enough to be able to say, I'm going to do these notes. This one I don't really agree with. I think I can, if I fix some of these other things, it will address this other issue that this reader has raised, and see what happens on the next draft. If you get the same note back from a different reader, that may be a signal that something really fundamentally does need to shift. I always recommend that you have a notebook and a pen, actual notebook and pen handy when you're doing a feedback session, because what you're going to want to do on the other side of that is to read back through all of your notes and start to really analyze what's going on. I always recommend that people take a cooling off period after they receive feedback. There are a lot of high emotions, no matter how professionally we approach the work. We do have a lot of high emotion around this, and sometimes it's good to just let it sit and have it percolate a little bit, so that when we come back to it, we're in a more objective frame of mind and we're ready to dive into the work of rewriting it. So give it a couple days, but then when you come back to it, I recommend categorizing your feedback into 3 categories. One of those categories is what I call easy notes. These are simple fixes that require minimal changes to your story. This might be stuff like page comments, like, oh, on page 5, you're missing a comma. Or on page 5, you used the wrong character name, or there's some other detail that needs to get fixed. But it's literally a go in and just fix it on the page. It doesn't necessarily impact anything else on a story level, right? We're not talking about structural changes. We're not talking about anything like that. We're basically talking about cleaning up the draft, things that are super easy to fix, or changes that are almost in a sense isolated to a single scene, right? Where you can fix that thing that happened in that scene, and you don't have to necessarily worry that that one change is going to have had massive ripple effects throughout the rest of the story. So categorize those as easy notes. And I'm going to talk about what you're going to do with those in just a second. Okay, so easy notes are set aside. Complex notes. Complex notes are the ones that I was just mentioning, the kind that are going to cause a ripple effect or domino effect through the rest of the story. Often these kinds of notes are going to necessitate an extensive rewrite. It may not require a page 1 rewrite where you're literally going back and you're rewriting the entire story from page 1. You're like essentially starting over. But it's going to require a pretty extensive rejiggering of everything that's in your work. Some of these can be situations where there's a plot problem or there's a character problem, and you're going to have to go back and you're going to have to fix that, the way that character is showing up, and it's going to impact every scene that that character is in and probably scenes that they're not in. Or if you're fixing something that happens in the plot, that's going to create a cascade effect. The last category of feedback that you might get, and this is the one that gets all of the attention a lot of times, is feedback that is unclear, or it feels ambiguous, or it feels so general. Like someone might say something like, yeah, I just really didn't like that character. Or I didn't feel like that character was showing up in the right way in the story. Well, what does that mean exactly, right? What do you mean you don't, what about them wasn't likable? And if you ask the question, they may not be able to tell you what it is that they didn't like. They just didn't like the character. Some of that could be personal preference, right? Some of that could just come down to a matter of taste. But oftentimes with a vague note or a note that's ambiguous, there is what we call the note beneath the note. There's something else that's going on in the story that is bothering this particular reader. They don't really know how to articulate it, and it comes out sounding like a preference thing, sounding like vague and a little ambiguous. Like, this scene didn't really work for me. Okay, well, why isn't it working? What's not right about it, right? So then you kind of have to put your detective hat on a little bit and try to dig underneath the surface. Try to identify what is it about that character or scene or aspect of your plot that might not be landing or might not be clear, and see if you can't identify that. So that may end up classifying that note as a complex note, right? That may be something that you need to spend a little bit of time going through, combing through, fixing. It may also end up being a situation where after cleaning up the other things, that issue has actually been resolved, right? You feel that now when you go back through with that note in mind, it's actually been clarified. Okay, so sometimes those notes get dealt with as you work through other things. If you're getting just a lot of really vague feedback, maybe try giving it to a second reader and seeing what they come up with. Sometimes different readers have different ways of approaching a story, and you might get clarification. They might be able to pinpoint something that the other reader really couldn't. But when you put the two things together, it becomes illuminative of what the actual problem is with your story. The temptation always with rewriting is that we want to start with the stuff that's easy. When I go through and do this with my notes from my feedback sessions, I literally make a checklist. I write out everything that I need to do according to the notes that I received. And sometimes things that I realized in part of the conversation that they may not have said, but that I have come to realize, or in reviewing the notes I come up with. And I literally make a checklist with boxes. And that's my document that I keep next to me. And I do that in a notebook, the same notebook that I've taken the notes in from the feedback session. And I can use different color highlighters to highlight the ones that are essentially page notes, the ones that are more complex. The temptation, going back to this now, the temptation is that we want to tackle the stuff that's easy first because we get that sense of satisfaction of checking off a whole bunch of things off our list. The problem is, if you go and make all of those changes and you spend time doing that, those scenes that you're addressing may not actually exist once you're done working through all of the complex notes that you have to deal with. Those scenes may not exist. That you may completely rewrite that chapter or that scene or that act, and then you've gone and spent all this time focused on making a bunch of changes that now are irrelevant. So do the hard thing first. Do the complex notes first. Figure out what the strategy is. Depending on what the note is, you may have to come up with a strategy. Which scenes do you need to rewrite? Which chapters are affected by that? How are you going to approach that? What's your strategy? Because the other problem is, the other thing that we can do is, instead of being strategic about the rewrite, we can just go back to page 1 and just start combing through the whole thing. And while that's not always a bad idea, I suggest a strategic and targeted rewrite. And then before you go back to submit it, you're going to go back to page 1 and you're going to read all the way through and you're going to smooth out everything so that we don't see the seams, so that we don't see, we call it rewrite residue, right? We kind of just clean everything up and just make sure that it looks the way that it needs to look. So that's in a nutshell, that's the process, right? We're going to approach this with the mindset of openness and collaboration. We're going to be willing to listen. We're going to take really good notes. We're going to give this our full attention. And we're going to be willing to hear what people have to say, even if it's really hard to hear. We have a detachment from the work. We're not going to take this personally. We realize that we're all here for the same reason. Okay, so that's the mindset piece. The technical piece is take the notes, give it a couple days to rest, go back through, comb through, classify your notes and create a checklist for yourself. And then start working through systematically to process through these notes. When you're done with that, don't just send it off. Go back through, start at page 1 and read the whole thing through. Make sure that what you've done makes sense. Before you turn it in, again, to your reader, to your manager, representation, your agent, whoever's reading the work for you, please run spell check. Okay. I always say this. I have a PhD in literature. I still use spell check, right? I run spell check. Grammar is practically my profession and I still run spell check. So making sure that it's cleaned up, making sure you don't have grammatical mistakes, spelling mistakes, formatting errors, right? Get rid of all of that, fix all of that so that you can send a nice clean copy to your reader as a second draft. And hopefully you're going to get really good feedback on the second draft. Hopefully you were able to tackle all of those notes and you're able to put together a really compelling draft. You may have still a few things that need to get cleaned up here and there, but hopefully you are well on your way then to producing that polished final draft. Just know that this rewrite process is something that is going to be with you for as long as you are writing, as long as you are writing professionally, as long as you are writing with the eye to getting it out there in the world and having other people look at it. Know that the process of receiving feedback on your work and of revising according to that feedback and then turning around another draft, that is part of the profession of writing. So figuring out the system that works for you and the mindset that you need to have in order to approach this well is going to serve you very, very well long-term in your writing career. If this was helpful to you, please like, subscribe, don't miss a video. If you have a question or you want to leave a comment, please do so below this video. There's some other helpful links there as well for you to check out. Have a great creative week, and I'll see you next time.